Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our session today, Compliance to Confidence, Simplifying PCI Security Standards. As promised, we will dive into all things compliance readiness and audit preparation with our experts today. Before we kick off, I want to remind everybody that the chat feature is available throughout the session. We will be leaving plenty of time in the second half of the discussion to answer all of your questions and address your comments. With me today is Kevin Wallen, head of PCI at Prescient Security, and Metin Kortak, CISO at Rhymetec. Metin, would you like to kick us off by doing a quick introduction about Rhymetec?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. My name is Metin. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Rhymetec. I've been working with the company for the past 7 years, building security service offerings. Just to give more context about what Rhymetec does, we are a cybersecurity firm, and basically we help organizations become compliant with various cybersecurity frameworks and help them with anything that they might need from a cybersecurity or compliance standpoint, and also provide penetration testing service offerings.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Or thanks for that, Metin. And Kevin, would you like to do a quick introduction on Prescient as well?
Absolutely. Kevin Whalen, Prescient Security. Prescient, primarily, we're a compliance and our security compliance assessment and audit firm. We work on numerous audit frameworks, primarily SOC 2, SOC 1, PCI, ISO, HITRUST. Those are our primaries. We also offer penetration testing services to support those compliance activities. And then we provide, we partner with firms like Rhymetec to help clients kind of understand what their scope requirements are for the various compliance activities and get them prepared for performing the actual audits. I've been with Prescient for about 2.5 years. I currently am responsible for the PCI services at Prescient Security. I've been a QSA for about 15 years. Looking forward to talking more about PCI with you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Metin. Thank you both for those introductions. Now let's dive into the topic itself. Kevin, I'd love to start with you to understand the importance of this topic today and give us some foundational insights around PCI.
Sure. I think where you start with PCI is kind of why, who needs it and why. Primarily or where things start, I guess, was PCI is that PCI is a framework, a compliance framework that's been defined and managed by the payment card brands, so Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, etc. So the payment card brands really own the responsibility for card data security, and they facilitate the implementation of the data security standard through the PCI SSC. But it's really the card brands that control it. And so when we talk with clients, when we're talking with prospects that are asking us about PCI compliance, they're normally trying to respond to either a request from a bank that is looking to utilize or partner with our clients to process or transmit cardholder data, or the other common way that we encounter prospects or clients is through business partner relationships. So a lot of times clients will come to us or prospects will come to us and indicate that they've had conversations with a business partner or potential business partner that is going to require them to be PCI compliant before they are permitted to connect to the partner systems. And so the partners, the business partners, may be the ones driving the requirement for the PCI compliance, but the standards are still all defined by the payment brands and facilitated by the PCI SSC.
Thanks, Kevin, for that. Metin, was there anything else that you wanted to add to the importance?
No, not on the importance, but I'd love to kind of walk through just some of the different levels of PCI for sure. I think that when organizations they need to become compliant, we usually look at two different types of organizations. These are usually merchants and service providers. And merchants are organizations that process payment information. accepting credit card information, transactions, and then there are service providers. And service providers are usually responsible with managing those type of transactions. That might be also organizations that provide like hosting services, managing things like firewalls and other networks. So depending on what type of an organization you are, there are different levels that PCI would apply to you with. So if you're a merchant, usually we go with about 4 levels in here. And the requirements change based on how many credit card transactions that you transmit and process on an annual basis. So the levels start usually from level 1 to level 4, and level 1 is the I would say probably the most strict level out there, where like most of the security requirements would apply to you. And then level 4 is where we have a lot of the bare minimum requirements. But like I said, each level has its own requirements in place. When it comes to the requirements here, I would say like with usually level 1 and level 2, there's always like a penetration testing requirement that customers have to go with. So they would need to go through like an annual penetration test that's conducted by a third party. But if they're going with just like level 3, level 4, there's usually just like more simple vulnerability scanning requirements that they would need to go through on an annual basis instead of going through a annual penetration test that's conducted by a third party. There's also differences around how the organizations are assessed for PCI compliance, depending on the certain levels. For instance, if an organization is just going with a level 4 requirement, there isn't a lot of, let's say, like third party audits that they would need to go through. Like if you have a customer that comes in and they only process less than like 20,000 transactions per year. Usually, those organizations they can become compliant with PCI by like doing certain self-assessments rather than going through a annual audit that's conducted by a third party. However, if they're going with like a level 1 certification, then that would also require a third-party assessment and audits and also penetration tests. So the requirements definitely change a lot there.
Great overview, Metin. And now that we've talked a little bit about the different levels of PCI, let's dive into some of the changes with version 4.0. Kevin, do you want to walk us through some of the changes that you're seeing?
Sure. For those that aren't aware, so PCI, the data security standards, that's what PCI DSS is. PCI DSS version 4 became effective April 1st of 2024 this year. So what that means is any PCI assessment conducted after March 31st of 2024 has to follow the new standard, the version 4.0 standard. And the 4.0 standard has a number of new requirements. Quite honestly, in my opinion, and working through several of these transitions over my career, I don't think of any of the changes as being overly difficult in terms of new additions to the requirements. There are a few that are, but they did a lot of what version 4.0 update did was kind of clean up some of the controls or requirement language, simplify some of the requirement language, consolidate some of the requirement language. But there are some significant new enhancements to it as well that people need to be aware of. If you're familiar with the old standard, obviously if you're just getting into PCI, you don't even need to worry about the old standard. But the one little thing before I'll talk about a couple of the changes here is that the new standard became effective April 1st of 24. But in total, there's about essentially 65 new or changed requirements that were implemented in version 4.0. 15 of those changes became effective as of April 1st. The other 50 are changes that don't become mandatory until after April 1st of 25. So you actually have a 1-year implementation time frame to address some of the, like I say, 50 of the 65 new requirements. So there is some time still. I mean, we're now almost 6 months through the initial year there. So most clients that we're working with now, we're starting to tell them it's now time to start addressing all of those new requirements if you haven't already, just to give yourself time to get them implemented. And so what are some of those changes? To me, the most significant change of 4.0 is what is commonly being referred to now as the payment page script security. So they've added some new requirements in the basically software development controls, as well as some automated security controls around monitoring for changes to the construction of your pages that contain input fields for cardholder data, where you now need to automate some change control tracking or file integrity monitoring type tracking on those payment pages so that you're aware when those changes happen. Essentially, there's the council, PCI DSS, and the card brands kind of evaluated trends within e-commerce transactions primarily, where there was an increase in the number of e-skimming type attacks. And so to address that risk or that emerging threat, they tried to implement a few controls around making sure that the controls for your payment pages, the pages that contain cardholder data capture on your e-commerce sites, are being better controlled, monitored, and tracked in terms of changes that you make to them. So payment page script security is, in my opinion, by far the heaviest lift of some of the new requirements. But in addition to the payment page security, we also have to deal with some new automated requirements. And so in prior versions of the PCI DSS, you were permitted to, there's requirements around making sure you develop applications in a secure manner, meaning you're protecting cardholder data in an appropriate way. Prior versions of PCI DSS permitted you to address some of those requirements through the use of manual code reviews or manual walkthroughs of code or training of people and making sure that the developers that are making code changes are aware of security requirements for protecting cardholder data. As of April 1st of 25, you'll now have to have an automated web application firewall or web application security tool in front of internet-facing applications that accept card data. It's been an optional implementation before version 4. And so, like I say, you had options to address these in manual ways, but as of April 1st, you have to have an automated solution, web application firewall most commonly. The other area where they're going to require automation is in security events, alerts. So you've always been required to retain log history for 12 plus months, security event logs. But again, prior to version 4, you were permitted to do a daily review of those security events to look for anomalies or potential attack vectors. Again, after April 1st of 25, you're going to be required to have some kind of security event alerting process. Security, a SIEM system is what most people think of with that, but there's different ways to address the requirement in terms of automated alerts, but it's no longer going to be acceptable to only do manual reviews of your log files. And then there's a couple that have got a lot of attention, but I think of as kind of in the category of administrative type controls. This role and responsibility matrix to really, I guess, to enforce or to emphasize the need to have people knowledgeable and aware of what the PCI DSS requirements are. There's now a requirement that you have to have an assignment of a role and responsibility for who's responsible for making sure that you remain compliant with requirement 1, network security controls, requirement 2, hardening, requirement 3, storing of card data, requirement 4, transmission of card data, et cetera, et cetera. So within each of those requirement areas, you now will have to have somebody designated as primarily responsible for making sure that the company stays compliant with those requirements. And so that's the role and responsibility matrix. Again, I think of it mainly as an administrative type control, not necessarily technical control. Targeted risk approach. One of the things that the PCI DSS version 4 has tried to implement or address is to provide more flexibility I'll just say flexibility in terms of how companies have to respond or implement controls around being compliant with PCI DSS 4.0. And so, in that context, there's always been numerous requirements that are defined as a kind of an annual or quarterly or semi-annual review period. Now they've made those. They've given you flexibility by saying you can define what your review period is based on your risk appetite. And so, the targeted risk approach or targeted risk assessment is now a new requirement that you have to comply with by, again, April 1st of 25, where any of these flexible definitions of a review period have to be defined within your targeted risk approach. Kind of the hand in hand with that we don't see much with Prescient, just with the client base that we have. We deal with a lot of startup clients, mainly cloud native. So most of our clients are running in AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. And a lot of them are startups, as I said there. And so typically with our clients, we don't see this often. And so I didn't really highlight it here, but as part of this new flexibility that the PCI SSC has introduced with version 4, there's this new capability to customize your controls. As I said, for the smaller companies we deal with, we don't really see the value of a customized approach yet. I think there's some areas where there could be some developments down the road here where customized approaches may have a better role to play, I guess, in helping give you flexibility to be compliant with PCI. But we don't have it. Like I say, not many of our clients do. One of the primary reasons we don't really approach it that often is that there's a fair amount of overhead associated with customizing your controls. Again, I don't really call it out in here, but if it's customized approach to satisfying a control or requirement is something that interests you, then there are some capabilities for you to do that and corresponding control requirements for you to address to make sure you address it appropriately. And then finally, there's been a few miscellaneous technical control changes. So the most common one we talk about with clients is really password length. So prior to version 4, password length was 7 characters minimum. And now under 4.0, password length is 12. So any system that is deployed in your cardholder data environment is required to support a password length now of 12 characters. And they've changed a few other minor controls around passwords, but the biggest one that at least we've encountered with our clients is the 12 character length. Minton, I don't know if you see other version 4 impacts to the clients you guys have been working with, but those are the ones we primarily see in our assessment activities so far.
Yeah, I think you covered everything, honestly. I do think like a lot of my customers are actually very happy to see that like the password rotation requirements have become a little bit more flexible, because I think that needing to rotate the passwords every 90 days, that was actually causing security problems, and it was also making everyone's jobs a lot harder. I think just a couple of years ago, NIST actually just like released some controls saying that like rotating passwords that often is actually bad for security and actually like benefiting security. So I was actually happy to see that with 4.0 they made those changes.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. The NIST actually came out and said, right, that password rotation, that forcing people to rotate passwords every 9 days created poor password security habits, poorer password security habits than just requiring long, strong passwords. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. And thanks, Kevin, for going over some of those high level changes to 4.0. You talked a little bit about manual tasks versus automated ones, and some of the customized approaches. And Metin, from your perspective, because I know Rhymetec does primarily a lot of readiness work around PCI, I'd love to hear from you about mapping out your PCI compliance journey and maybe what that looks like.
Yeah, of course. And thank you. And I guess I don't have to mention this, but obviously customers, they want to become PCI compliant because they process credit card information and payment details. So when we start our scoping process, what we usually try to understand in the beginning is how the payments are being processed. And usually with that, there's a couple of options here. But probably the first one and the most obvious one that we see is when credit card is present with the person that's actually the owner of that credit card. This is usually the point of sales that we refer to. So this is something like you go to the grocery store and you hand in your credit card to make a payment and you check out. So it's very simple, very straightforward. There isn't any other information that you need to provide to the grocery store or like any merchant that you're buying whatever you're from. So that's usually very straightforward, and like that's something that we want to understand with our customers. Where it gets more complex, and this probably happens more in my line of work because we work with a lot of SaaS providers, is when the physical card is not present when you're making a purchase. So this usually happens during e-commerce purchases. And because the physical card is not present, PCI actually has certain requirements in place so that when you are making a purchase online, you also need to input some additional information. If you have ever bought anything online, usually after putting in your credit card information, you also need to put in information like maybe your zip code, maybe your billing address, your first and last name. All of this information is required for you to make purchases online because PCI actually has requirements in place that require merchants to request additional information from the buyers or whoever is the owner of the credit card. So that's really like why that type of information needs to be added there. And it is something that we as the CISOs need to understand, because depending on how the payments are being processed, how the credit card information is being collected by the buyers, that impacts the level of work that we're going to do for our customers. Another not so common way to receive payments that we have seen is usually through telephone orders or through call centers. If you need to like call a store or somewhere else and you need to give your credit card information over the phone, then in that case, there's usually more strict requirements in place. Like maybe the agent that you're speaking with, they need to enter the credit card information into a PCI compliance system directly. They may not be allowed to write down the credit card information on any things like pieces of paper. And there needs to be just a lot of training involved to make sure agents that are collecting the credit card information are trained with the safety best practices. But the methods of how the payments are being done is usually one of the first things that we try to understand from our customers so that we can build a project plan that's appropriate for our customers, and we can actually look into implementing these security controls that are required by PCI standard based on the payment methods. Another thing when it comes to scoping that we need to do is defining the cardholder data environment. What that means is we need to understand exactly where the card information is being processed. Is it only processed in the customer's hosting provider like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, DigitalOcean, those type of providers? Or does the card information also reside in other third-party applications or physical servers? It's important for us to understand the entire scope so that when we are going through an audit with an auditing firm like Prescient, we can actually give them the proper scope, and we can make sure that the PCI security controls are implemented on all of those hosting providers and other vendors that actually touch the credit card information. This is very important because if we don't understand the scope fully, and let's say we only assume that credit card information is only processed on one of the vendors and we implement the security controls on there, but during the audit, it is revealed that credit card information is also transmitted on other applications that we didn't know about, then at that point it would be almost impossible for us to obtain PCI certification because we didn't do the work that's needed on the appropriate scope. So scoping it is definitely very important. Um, After we have scoped this out and understood exactly what payment methods are being supported by the customer, what we do is just following a prioritized approach. What that means is understanding the control activities. With the PCI DSS standards, there's around, I think, like 300 something individual control activities. So we do need to assess each control, also understand if any of the controls are not applicable to our customers in case there's any sort of not applicabilities that apply. We need to ensure that if the customer is using third-party vendors for processing payment information, those vendors also maintain their PCI DSS certifications. Otherwise, we might need to do some additional work to ensure compliance. And once we identify all of the in-scope requirements, that's when we look into creating a priority list and building out a project plan. And at least in our procedures, what we usually start out by doing is conducting a gap assessment. First, understanding if the customer has already implemented those controls. There is a likely chance that most organizations out there may have already implemented maybe 10 to 15% of the PCI DSS controls, or maybe even more, especially if the organizations are already complying with other cybersecurity frameworks are out there like ISO 27001, SOC 2 Type 2. Then with those controls in place, you actually have a higher chance of already completing some of the PCI DSS standard requirements. So the gap assessment is very important because it gives us an understanding of what controls have been implemented and what controls we need to implement to achieve PCI compliance. So after the gap assessment, what we will usually do is based on the outstanding requirements and all of the non-compliant controls, we will conduct a risk assessment and build a project plan based on our risk assessment and the gap assessment report that we have created. And the project plan will include everything that we need to do in order to achieve compliance. And obviously, that's a very simplified version of what we do, but this process usually for us takes about like at least 6 to 12 months.
Awesome. Thanks, Metin. Those are all amazing points on the readiness aspect of everything. Um, and I know on the Rhymetec side, we do get some clients that come to us where their vendors are asking them to become PCI compliant, but they're not necessarily processing any sort of payment card information. So what advice would you give to those clients that are getting asked for those requirements, but are not necessarily processing any sort of payment card info?
Yeah, this happens quite a lot. And one thing I will say is that you do not need to be PCI compliant if you are not processing payment information. However, there are cases where your customers may request you to become PCI compliant. And in those cases, we have covered this requirement using different ways. Number one, we go with a self-assessment level 4 option. So we still implement the necessary requirements, make sure that the customer still has implemented all the PCI controls on all of the in-scope systems in place. And then we generate a self-assessment report and provide that to the customer. Second option would be utilizing a third-party auditing firm to write an attestation letter or conduct a PCI audit to state that the organization is not actually processing credit card information. So those type of attestations usually help a lot because it is a official letter stating that you do not process credit card information, you do not transmit any credit card information, and that usually gives their customers some peace of mind to understand that they're not processing credit card information, and because of that, they are not subject to PCI requirements. But I have never really seen a company needing to go through a level 1 assessment when they do not process or transmit any sort of credit card information. In my opinion, that would be an overkill.
For sure. Thanks for clarifying that, Metin. And Kevin, additional customer requirements. What else do we need to know?
Yeah, I think I'll piggyback on some of what Minton was saying that the you have two options when you look at any kind of PCI assessment. You can do a self-assessment, either as a merchant or a service provider. which is exactly what that means. You can do your own assessment and assess yourself against the PCI DSS standard, or you can partner with a compliance company like Prescient Security that can provide you a signed attestation that you're complying with PCI DSS for whatever requirements are in scope. But the most important thing, I would agree with what Min said, that the most important part is defining what your cardholder data environment is. You know, obviously I'm in the business of doing compliance audits, but I also in the business of working with clients, and like I say, a lot of our clients are kind of startup clients, and so I hate to see people waste money on compliance activities if they're not required. To me, that's a waste of resources, and if you're not required to go through PCI compliance, don't do it. Now, the challenge is, as Minton said, that you may have a business partner that requires you to demonstrate your PCI compliant, even if you have no card data in your environment. And so, it's very, very important you define what your cardholder data environment is in terms of what systems are in scope, kind of how your customers um, invest in you in terms of your impact on card data security is kind of the way I think about it as card data security. But probably more as important as that is making sure you understand for service providers that you're using how they help you comply with PCI compliance. And so, obvious ones are like AWS and Google Cloud, right? They provide you a data center to run your payloads in or your infrastructure in. And obviously, they're providing physical security controls for those data centers. You don't have any responsibility to demonstrate that you're providing physical security controls over an AWS data center. So that's a classic example of inheriting their compliance status from AWS. But it gets even more interesting as you expand those service providers out to various payment gateways, data vault providers, et cetera, where you kind of have to decompose where does card data live, where does it move in the systems that I support, and kind of get to the concluding statement, as Benton said, if you're not really processing or transmitting or storing card data, then you may not really have any sort of compliance activities that you need to perform, but you can still document that within, like I say, an SAQ or some other document like that, a self-assessment questionnaire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And that's a great piece of advice too. For anybody that is unsure about their PCI compliance journey, the requirements, the scope, it's great to work with a professional, either somebody who does vCISO work like Rhymetec or somebody like Prescient who could help you scope out your journey, just to make sure that you're not being overly onerous in what you're doing to build your information security program and build those standards. So those are all amazing points. And then just to get into the last bit of information, Kevin, I'd love to hear from you, like some auditor advice on this journey.
Yeah, typically when we get engaged or when people are talking to us, it's normally because they either unsure, they're unsure what they need to do to be PCI compliant, and whether or not they even need to be go through a PCI DSS assessment, I'll say. And so that's a very common conversation that we'll have with a prospect around, do I need to be PCI compliant if this is kind of the way I impact my customers' cardholder data security. And then the second most common reach out to us comes from clients that are being told by business partners or potential business partners, more likely than not. It's the ones we commonly see is I want to partner with somebody, but in order to partner with them, they're going to require me to be PCI compliant. And so, and a lot of times those business partners will say, we're not going to accept just an unattested SAQ is what it's called, where you've gone through and done the attestation yourself. Many, depending on the size of the business partner, right? If you're talking about FIS or WorldPay or one of those large entities, they're going to always ask you to do it with a QSA just because that's the way their vendor management processes work. But there are options for you to do it yourself. But if you need to engage with a QSA to do an attestation, sign off on your assessment, then you can do. We have clients that we work with that are doing what's called the level 1 ROC or some that are even doing self-assessment questionnaires. It's not uncommon for us to be working with a client that has a development system. It's not even in production yet. It's still on the drawing boards, and they're fleshing it out, and yet they need this relationship with a business prospect or business partner to continue to get funding or whatever, keep the business alive. And that business partner is saying you need to go through a PCI DSS assessment. So, the first thing I always ask is, will they accept an SAQ, or are they going to require a level 1? Because it's less expensive for us to help you do an SAQ than it is for us to help you do a level 1 PCI assessment, just because of the level of documentation required in a level 1. So you have options in terms of SAQs and level 1 rocks, and utilize an assessor like a QSA to assist you in doing either the level 1 rock or a self-assessment questionnaire.
Awesome. Thank you for that amazing advice, Kevin. And now that we've covered everything from PCI 4.0 through the readiness into the audit, I want to take some time to address some of the audience Q&A. We've had a lot of collaboration in the audience chat, so thank you everybody for your comments and all your candor. I'll go ahead and start with one of the first questions that came in. It is, while in the transition period from version 3.2 to 4.0, how do the monthly or quarterly requirements come into play? For example, the vulnerability and penetration tests, do they have to go via the 4.0 standards, or immediately can we still scan on version 3.2 while in the transition period?
Yeah, I can answer that question. In the 4.0, in the new 4.0 PCI DSS standard, there are the requirements that aren't mandatory until after March 31st of 25. All are labeled or include the description that this is considered a security best practice until after March 31st of 25. So what that basically is saying is this technically is not yet a mandatory requirement. It's a security best practice until March 31st of 25. So you have until March 31st of 25 to implement those. In the meantime, they would be considered not applicable to you.
Great. Metin, anything else you wanted to add there?
No, I think that was covered everything. Thanks, Kevin.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. The next question that we had actually got answered from one of the participants, but would love your guys' feedback on this as well. What role does third-party risk management play in PCI compliance? The response that was given was, if you're using a third party to process or store your credit card information, you generally need to obtain that company's own attestation or certification document to include with your own PCI audit. That seems like a very straightforward answer, but do either of you have anything else to add?
I would just add here that definitely collecting the PCI certifications is important, especially if the vendor is processing or transmitting credit card information. That's one of the required pieces. But aside from that, you still need to conduct vendor assessments on all of your vendors, and that needs to go beyond just collecting the PCI certifications. That might mean checking if those vendors have proper information security policies in place, if they have conducted their own business continuity tabletop exercises, if they conduct access reviews, just really conducting a thorough due diligence. And I think that just collecting the PCI certification is very important, but there's definitely more work that needs to be done to conduct a proper vendor assessment on the vendors that you have.
Nicole, if I could add to that too, please. The other thing that is it's evolved. It's been evolving significantly, I would say, over the last few years. In addition to getting an attestation of compliance, most technology service providers, payment service providers within the PCI environments today will also provide you with a role and responsibility matrix. I always go to AWS and say, that's to me is the gold standard for role and responsibility matrix, because it actually goes down to the requirement level based on the AWS service you're using and describes what's your responsibility if you're using AWS Lambda functions, what's your responsibility for internal vulnerability scans or external vulnerability scans? And so they help you, those role and responsibility matrix, if done right, help you understand what my responsibility is versus what responsibility the technology service provider is providing. So in addition to the AOC, get the role and responsibility matrix. Not everybody has one yet, but they are becoming more and more common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both of you. Thank you. Those are great pieces of advice. And for anybody that's actually starting to kick off their PCI compliance journey, would you recommend that they go straight into 4.0 at this point in time?
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome.
There really isn't a choice at this point in time. You have to do 4.0 after March 31st of 24.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, do you deal with all the security best practices now, or do you wait until March 28th of 2025?
Exactly. And for anybody else that's also starting on their PCI compliance journey and kind of mapping out not only what the roles and responsibility will be amongst their team, but maybe costs associated with it, what are some potential hidden costs that could come up in somebody's PCI compliance journey? I know we talked a little bit about pen testing. There might be different like scans that companies have to do. So what are some of the hidden costs that people might not initially expect?
I can add on a few things here. I wouldn't say like hidden costs probably from like the auditing side, because I think those costs are usually like pretty straightforward. However, for implementing the security controls, you may need to pay for some additional security softwares. These might be things like your intrusion detection software. You may need to pay for mobile device management tools, antivirus tools. You may need to pay for a SIM tool, and you may also need to pay for additional logs that you're collecting due to some log retention requirements. So those are probably more indirect costs that organizations need to look out for. But I will say it is very difficult to usually calculate them, especially when it comes to costs around retaining logs. But it's more straightforward to understand the costs for things like mobile device management tools, intrusion detection systems, and other SIM tools that you're going to need to utilize.
I would add a couple things to it, I'm sure Minton sees this as well, but pen testing be the example. I know it's not considered necessarily a hidden cost, but one thing we commonly see, because we work with clients that are trying to do PCI compliance and SOC compliance and high trust, et cetera, PCI does have some unique additional requirements around pen testing that you don't normally see with some of the other compliance frameworks. So PCI requires external network, internal network, and network segmentation testing as part of your pen testing strategy. So those may be typically when I see a pen test from a SOC client, it's normally an external pen test. So we always have to consult with our clients on making sure they cover all three aspects: external, internal, network segmentation. And then the other thing, kind of in the vulnerability management realm still, is vulnerability scanning. PCI does require that you do a quarterly, every 90-day external vulnerability scan using an approved scanning vendor. So there's a special set of requirements that are managed by PCI SSC for registering approved scanning vendors, ASVs. PCI SSC maintains a list of who all those ASVs are, but you have to use one of those registered services to do your quarterly external vulnerability scans every 90 days. Those are a couple
Yes.
items. We typically, again, we encounter those a lot when we're talking with a client, particularly new to PCI, that may not know that they have to have these approved scanning vendors involved in scoping the pen test appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think we've seen that on our side as well, making sure that they have the correct vendor actually doing their scans and making sure that they are certified or accredited to do that process for them. But yeah, thank you both for that additional bit of information. I don't see any additional questions coming in at this time. I think we answered all of them. So I just wanted to wrap up the discussion for today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And a special thank you to you, Kevin, and Metin, for all of your insights on this topic. As a reminder, you should receive the recording of this session within the coming days, alongside some helpful materials from both Prescient and Rhymetec. We look forward to continuing to stay in touch with you all, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you,
Thanks,
Kevin.
Nicole. Nice.
Guys.
Thank you, Nick. Bye.
Bye.